Every January, a quiet town in the Swiss Alps turns into the capital of the world. Snow drifts across glass chalets and security checkpoints. Black cars snake through the mountain fog. Helicopters hum over the valley. Inside, presidents, billionaires, bankers, and tech titans gather to fix the world, or so they say. They call it the World Economic Forum, but most people just call it Davos. They arrive to talk about equality, sustainability, and the future of humanity. Then, as the snow melts, they board their private jets, markets reopen. And the world looks exactly the same, only a little worse. The rich are richer. The poor are poorer, and the system runs on, unchanged, just rebranded. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Because the real story of Davos isn't hidden in conspiracies. It's right out in the open, in press releases, photo ops, and polite applause. Its power doesn't come from secrecy. It comes from normality, from pretending not to need to hide. The beginning, the World Economic Forum isn't a government. It has no borders, no voters, and no accountability. And yet, for over 50 years, it has quietly shaped how markets move, how policies form, and how progress is defined. It began in 1971. A 33-year-old German engineer named Klaus Schwab invited 450 business leaders to a Swiss resort. The idea was simple, a conference on modern management. But timing is everything. That same year, the United States abandoned the gold standard, ending the post-war economic order. Inflation soared, governments were losing control. And corporations were learning they didn't need governments to grow. Schwab's European Management Symposium offered something revolutionary. A neutral ground, away from parliaments, away from protests, where CEOs, economists, and policymakers could talk freely. No politics, just power. Switzerland was the perfect setting, neutral, rich, discreet. A nation built on banking became home to the world's first summit of borderless business. It wasn't about democracy. It was about efficiency. The rise at first, Davos was a curiosity, an expensive networking event. But Schwab's ambition turned it into something bigger, a platform for coordination between governments and corporations. As the 1970s brought oil shocks and inflation, governments were paralyzed, but corporations were adapting fast. Davos gave them a stage. By the 1980s, it wasn't just a conference anymore. It was an institution, an unofficial parliament of globalization. By 1992, it had a new name, the World Economic Forum. A title that sounded as official as the United Nations, but wasn't. The WEF is a private foundation, not a public body. No treaties. No elections. No oversight. Yet presidents and prime ministers came year after year, eager to be seen among the elite. For politicians, it meant legitimacy. For CEOs, influence. For central bankers, control. And for Davos itself, credibility. The Church of Globalization after the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed, capitalism stood alone. The WEF seized the moment. It rebranded the pursuit of profit as the pursuit of progress. Globalization became the new global religion, and Davos became its Vatican. Oligarchs, financiers, and politicians from Washington to Beijing made the pilgrimage. That was Schwab's genius. Davos didn't fight for power. It absorbed it. It didn't overthrow nations. It invited them in. It offered access, legitimacy, and belonging for a price. A basic membership cost around $60,000 a year. But a strategic partnership, over $600,000. And the partners weren't random companies, they were the giants. BlackRock, Microsoft, Goldman Sachs, BP, Pfizer, Google. In return, they got access, direct conversations with those who make the laws. The public speeches about sustainability and equity were just theater. The real business happened behind closed doors. No votes, no minutes, no headlines, just influence. The system that doesn't need to hide nothing that happens in Davos is illegal. That's the brilliance. It doesn't need to conspire. When you put the world's most powerful people in the same room, alignment happens naturally. Every year brings a new theme. The Fourth Industrial Revolution, the Great Reset, stakeholder capitalism. They sound visionary, even noble. But the outcome is always the same. Policies that make global capital safer, smoother, and more profitable. When the WEF promoted the Great Reset after the pandemic, The message was utopian: rebuild the world for fairness and sustainability. But in practice, the money flowed straight into private hands. Yes, the world was being reset by the people who already owned it. The language of legitimacy, Davos's true power isn't in decisions, it's in definitions. It doesn't make laws, it shapes the vocabulary laws are written in. It doesn't control markets, it writes their moral justification. When the same oil companies funding the conference sponsor climate panels, that's not hypocrisy, it's strategy. If you can define the terms of reform, you never have to pay its price. By the 2000s, the WEF had become more than a conference. It was a culture. Through its Young Global Leaders program, it groomed a generation of politicians, executives, and influencers who all spoke the same dialect of progress: efficient, data-driven, inevitable. That's what makes Davos powerful. Not secret deals, shared assumptions. Not control, consensus. Not force, alignment. Crisis and continuity. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Davos pivoted instantly. It called for a new kind of capitalism, one that valued stakeholders over shareholders. It sounded radical. But the same banks that crashed the system were now leading the reform. They didn't lose power. They consolidated it. Governments debated austerity. Davos offered the illusion of progress, without accountability. Then, in 2020, the pandemic arrived. Markets froze, economies shut down, and the world's richest doubled their wealth. The WEF returned with a familiar promise: the Great Reset. This time the message was to rebuild greener, fairer, more inclusive. But reset didn't mean redistribute. It meant digitize, automate, and monetize the next frontier of human life. Stakeholder capitalism became the moral cover, a way for corporations to define good without public input. Regulation by branding, accountability by press release. The architecture of power. Look closely and you see the pattern. The same corporations funding the WEF advise governments on climate, health, and trade. The same consulting firms that design ESG standards sell the audits to enforce them. The same banks that talk about inclusion quietly influence monetary policy. Davos isn't a conspiracy. It's coordination, visible, structured, and self-reinforcing. Outside, protesters march in the snow while private jets crowd the airfield. Inside, champagne flows as leaders talk about carbon neutrality. The contradictions aren't mistakes, they're the ritual. Proof that Davos doesn't need to hide its hypocrisy anymore. Because to skip it is to signal irrelevance. Davos is the stage where power performs virtue. A place where every crisis becomes a business plan. The gospel of efficiency, the WEF doesn't need to force anyone. It wins through agreement. When you gather those who control most of the world's capital, you don't need conspiracy, you need consensus. Climate change becomes a market. Public health becomes a product. Poverty becomes impact investing. Every cause can be monetized, as long as it yields a return. That's why Davos feels untouchable. It's not an ideology, it's a framework. It can absorb any criticism, any opposition. If you accuse it of greed, it answers with philanthropy. If you question its legitimacy, it invites you to join. Every empire learns the same trick: make rebellion look like participation. The end of illusion. In many ways, Davos is the logical endpoint of modern capitalism. A borderless economy needs a borderless council. A place where nation-states look sovereign but act like subsidiaries of global capital. But outside those glass walls, trust is breaking. Populism, polarization, and despair are symptoms of a system that preaches morality but runs on self-interest. People can feel it. Decisions are being made elsewhere by people they'll never meet. And they're right. Because the machinery of global coordination has outgrown democracy's reach. Davos is its cathedral. The real power of Davos isn't in its speeches. It is in the silence afterward. The unspoken agreement that no matter what happens, the rules won't change. The flow of capital will continue. And those who benefit most will always be trusted to save the system they built. But history doesn't work that way. Empires built on moral certainty always collapse from within. Every civilization builds a priesthood to justify its power. Rome had senators. The church had cardinals. The modern world has Davos. The names change. The ritual doesn't, and one day, maybe sooner than they think, the illusion will break. Because every system that manages the world eventually forgets how to listen to it. And when that happens, the next great reset won't come from the top. It'll come from below. If this gave you a new perspective, Hit subscribe. History doesn't repeat, it reveals. And if you know where to look, you'll see the future hiding in plain sight.